The context API lets us do one thing: elevate local state to a global state. So multiple components can have access to the state without the traditional passing down state as props through the trickle down method. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say trickle down method, I'll have a link in the description below to a video. It's a quick video, I think 2.5 minutes. Briefly explains how ReactJS works, how it handles propagating data throughout the app. In this video, I'm just going to create a class component that's going to act as our one-stop shop for global state, and from that, all other components will have access to the global state. So I have a basic ReactJS app up and running. If you want to know how to do that, I'll have a link in the description below. If you're watching on YouTube, there should be a card on the top right here. So all this little app does is display this page here. We have a header component with a variable called name that has the value rex, and then we have, you can't see it, but there's a blog or blogs container that wraps all of these individual little blog posts. That container has another variable called name, value rex. It passes it down to each post, and each post then has an individual image blog component in it, and it passes that same name down to the image blog component. So all this just to say that our blogs container component has a variable called name with rex. It passes it down 3 steps or 2 steps down to blog post sends it down to image blog component. So why is the header rex displaying as rex and these guys displaying? Are these guys the same guy, the same variable? The answer is no. This blogs container is not sending this same rex up to the header. They exist on 2 different levels. And so I had to define a name here in the blogs container and a name here in the app, which sends it to welcome header. This is okay because it's just a string, but what if this guy was complicated? What if he was an object, an arrays, complicated state? If you wanted to update the state of this guy, we'd have to also go to this page and update the state of this guy. Big no-no. So what we're going to do is we're going to elevate this name rex to a global state in a one-stop shop, one place. So if we want to change this rex and this rex and this rex and this rex and this rex, all those rexes, we change it once in one file and it'll propagate throughout the whole system. And so there are 2 sides to this coin. There's the provider side and the consumer side. Let's tackle the provider side. So to create a context first, there are, let's say, 4 steps. We're going to create a component that's going to act as our one-stop shop. It's going to be a class component. So it's going to be a class component, and it's going to have, this is where we're going to manage the state of our store, our global context. This is where we're going to hold rex, just like that. So that's the first step. The second step was we have to actually create the context. So const my context, like that. And we're going to say react.create context. We're going to say default of Lala with the defaults in a second. So that's the second step, my context. Third step is any sort of JSX in here that you're going to return. You need to wrap it in a provider. That provider is provided by the context. So my context.provider and value. I'll explain this value in a second. Just clean up the code. All right, so this value here overwrites this value here. So this value is going to be tied to the local state of our one-stop shop. So this value is going to be this.state.name, just like that. And then we change these 2 divs to, this is a bit of JSX, so this.props or JavaScript, how ReactJS handles nesting. So what we're saying is anything that gets wrapped in this, you're going to see in a second, anything that gets wrapped in this provider, which is represented by this.props.children, will have access to this provider right here. And so that's the third step. First step is you create your class component, your one-stop shop. Second step is you create the actual context. You can give it a default value if you want. We did. Third step is you wrap all your JSX in a provider. And the fourth step is we export the context like this. Export context. So we have it all set up. We have the global state all set up, ready to go. How do we consume it? There are 2 different ways, one for function and one for class. So let's handle the function first. Blog image is a function. Yes, it's a function. All right. So we're going to, this part's a bit confusing, but through seeing it, hopefully it alleviates that confusion. So import my context from, and we'll say / one-stop shop. And then we're going to say import the actual one-stop shop. Again, this is kind of confusing, but hopefully through seeing it, you'll see why we're doing it this way, or why it is done this way, one-stop-shop.js like that. All right, so how does a function component hook up to global context? Well, instead of wrapping in a provider like this, we wrap in a consumer. And that consumer comes from or is provided by the context. So my context like this, dot consumer. All right. There we go. So this consumer gives us the context, but in order to use it, we have to write a function that takes it in. So we're going to say context. I'm going to rewrite this in 2 seconds because it looks a bit weird to people coming or new to JavaScript and maybe new to ES6. I think ES6 did arrow functions. So all we're doing is my context.consumer gives us the context. We write a function that takes that context and returns, excuse me, this should be returns that JSX. But because we wrote a function that accepts the context, we can use that context within the function. So let me just write it this way. It's a lot less confusing. So function, it's an anonymous function. So there's no name to this function. So function gets a parameter called context, and this function just returns all the JSX. And instead of using the props.name now, we can use it directly from the global state, which is context. And this context is a string because this guy is a string. If this guy was an object that had name in it, then we'd have to say context.name. But since it's directly a string, we can just say context like that. Let's go to the front end and see what we get. So we have welcome Rex. This guy's still a prop in local state. We have Rex here in the individual post, which is still a prop in local state. And then we have image by Lala. And this guy's from the global state. Why is it Lala when we said override with Rex right here? We said take this.state.name. This is the one-stop shop. This is where we're going to have all of our global state. We said override that global state right here with our default value Rex or Lala. What's going on here? If we don't explicitly tell your consumer from your context where to consume from, it assumes directly from the context, which is always going to be this static, this immutable Lala. So in order to tell it, hey, we want you to consume from this provider here with this overriding value, we have to wrap the consumer in the you could say the provider. So one-stop shop like this. So now this consumer is going to consume whichever provider is closest to it. We can have multiple one-stop shops, which is kind of weird, but we can have multiple providers. So now we go to the front end, we get image by Rex. And so this Rex, again, is a prop from a local state. This Rex is a prop from a local state. This Rex here is from global state. From this one-stop shop, this provider, we wrapped the consumer in this provider. Now, let's see what happens when we change the one-stop shop name here. Let's change it to like that. We go to the front page. Of course, it reflects right here. Let's change it back to Rex. Okay, so this is an okay way of doing it. But right now, let's say we had this welcome header as well, and we wanted this one to also consume from the global state. Well, we'd have to import the my context, the one-stop shop. We then have to surround this guy by one-stop shop and consumer, and then write all the code. An easier way to do this is to surround your whole app with by the one-stop shop. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the one-stop shop out of this blog image. We're going to surround the whole app with the one-stop shop like that. I'm going to take this guy away. And so now any component that exists, because we did this .props.children, any component that gets wrapped by this one-stop shop, like that, one-stop shop, will have access to the context. All we have to do is actually explicitly consume it. So just because you have access to it doesn't mean you're using it. Doesn't mean you can just go around in your code saying context like that. You still have to consume with a consumer. So we're going to do that for the header. So import. There we go. So now we go back to our front page. To fix the thing here. It should be components. So components / one-stop shop. There we go. So now this Rex is global. This Rex is global. This Rex right here, that's still local. Let's fix that guy up. That guy exists in the blog post. And this is a class. So how do we handle hooking up to context with a class? A lot simpler. There's a static property in a class called context type. So the class we have here is blog content. Content type is equal to, and my context. Not my context.consumer, just my context. So we have to import that my context from the one-stop shop. So my context from /one-stop-shop.js. There we go. And we can use this guy with this dot context. So let me uncomment these two guys out. So instead of this dot props.name, we're just going to say this dot context like this. This dot context. So this is how we consume username class. We just set the static variable context type to my context, and then we can use it with this dot context. We go back to the front, and now we see that this guy is also a global. How do we know if it's global? And how do we know it's not? We're not just tricking you. Let's change this guy to that guy. Look at that! Wow. Go back to the front page, and we see bop bop bop. Now, why didn't this guy change on the header? Maybe we're tricking you because we didn't change here. It should be props.name. It should be context. And now we go back and we go blah, 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 blah. Perfect. And so we've created a context. We've consumed from the context, from the global state. How do we influence or send something back to change the global state? Well, you do it exactly the same way you do it in ReactJS, which is the parent has to send down a function to the child. The child runs the function. That function actually runs on the parent's level. And because you can influence the parent, you also influence the child. So let's do that. And so we're going to do some recoding here. So currently our state, our value that we're passing in is just a string, but we also want to pass in a function. That function is going to be called change name like this. Its value is going to be this dot, say change name like this. And we're going to define the change name here. Change name equals new name. So again, all we're doing is we're writing a function in the parent component, in this case, the global one-stop shop component, that we're going to send down to any child component that wants to use it. Once they execute it, it's going to execute on this level. It's going to change the state of this component. Set state. We're going to say name is equal to new name. And because of this state, the local state of our one-stop shop is hooked up to the context. This is how we're influencing global context. We can't change this guy ever directly. We have to, this is the whole point of writing a class component that hooks up to the context. Through the class component, because we can change a class component, we can, in a roundabout way, change the global context. And so we have change name, this dot change name, perfect, it's a function, perfect, perfect. And so now this value is going to be an object and not just a string name. So now we're sending an object as the value, which means all this breaks, and that's because this guy is an object now, not a string. And so in that object there's the name. In the object there's a name. Let's say name. In this object there's a name, and then in our image as well, right here, context.name. Let's see if we got our code back. Perfect, perfect. And where's this guy? Where is the, or maybe we're not sending it properly. Name is blank. That's because name is blank. Oops. Rex. There we go. So it was working. All right. So we're ready to go with this. We have our global state, which is not just a name anymore. It's a name plus the function that we give to our children. Let's run that function on a child. This guy right here. So that guy exists on the blog post, this button. So when we click this button, this change name button, we're going to have another change name here. And it's going to accept from the context the actual parent or global context change name. It's just going to send the new name. So now when we click that button, perfect. Let's go to the front end. Let's change the name to, let's say, tungsten. And again, we're running this function that was passed down to us from the parent, from the global context. We click change name, and just like that, we see tungsten, 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 tungsten. We can change the name from this little individual component to this. And we see the name change here, change the name to that. JPOW, all right. And so that's how we influence. We accepted state, global state. Now we're giving global state. Same way, pass down a function from your one-stop shop. Any child that chooses to run that function will execute in the one-stop shop because we can influence the one-stop shop, and that one-stop shop is hooked up to the global context. We can, in a roundabout way, actually influence this static sort of default global context. And so that's going to be it for this video. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope it wasn't too convoluted. it can be a bit to wrap your head around, but just understand that we're elevating state, local state that we normally maybe need to pass around in an app, and it can get confusing. This prop passes to that prop, this child passes to that child. We're just elevating it to one place that we can concentrate on. We change it in that one place, and then it just propagates throughout the whole app. So if this helped you at all, don't forget to leave a like, a share, comment, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, all that stuff. I'll see you guys in the next video.